Next, we move on to another topic. The world cannot exist just for five. This is a reference to the members of the UN Security Council. This is one of the ideas that is becoming increasingly popular around the world about this and about what Europe still has to say. Serhiy Kyslytsia, the first Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, shared his important perspective with our colleague Natalie Mazvichuk. The interview took place immediately after the international forum, Global Reset, where Russia's war against Ukraine was one of the most central topics. The conversation turned out to be really interesting. Let's watch it now. And at 16 o'clock, our special broadcast from the remote location will begin.
Mr. Serhiy, welcome. Thank you for agreeing to give this interview. And the issue of security guarantees, is it still being discussed in any circles? Has everyone come to the conclusion that Ukraine needs to be given weapons, that Ukraine needs to be given an opportunity?
Security is discussed daily.
Security guarantees?
Security guarantees are discussed daily. And as I said, when it comes to the political and diplomatic level, there are three key levels of these. The discussions take place at the presidential level, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and National Security Advisors. In our case, that's the head of the President's office, Andriy Yermak. And these conversations happen every day, believe me, if not offline, then online. And
do you have any vision of ideal security guarantees for the Ukrainian situation?
Well, nothing in this world is perfect. We should all strive for perfectionism, but perfectionism is unattainable. The only thing I can tell you is that I am certain that we Ukrainians will never again agree to pseudo security assurances, let's call them that. Let me remind you that in Budapest there weren't even any guarantees. In everyday speech, we all say guarantees when talking about the Budapest Memorandum. In reality, that word wasn't even used there. In fact, it was about assurances regarding security. No, this mechanism and this format are no longer acceptable. In fact, they are absolutely unacceptable. The discussion should be, and you can see this in the official statements of the President and the Foreign Minister, about legally binding agreements, meaning they must be legally enshrined. Guarantees that will pass through the national parliament and the US Congress, and only then will they be implemented, including, regardless of what regularly happens in democratic societies. This is the electoral cycle when elections take place, and then a new political regime comes in, new political parties.
They were independent from the world?
Yes, of course. That is exactly why I believe this is already an important factor that both our European partners and, in fact, what we are also hearing in Washington as well, have clearly recognized and understood that any new guarantees must be extremely solid, robust, and most importantly, legally binding. This is a key point that should not be underestimated.
It's unusual that we're working, but why are you putting these guys
on the information? No, I don't know. Honestly, I'm curious myself where you get this idea that negotiations and dialogue trap.
Said I'm just here, as a representative,
I will... No, wait, I think you're oversimplifying Trump's words a bit. No, that didn't happen. Thank you. From what I know, Washington insists on Europe's leading role, that's true. And they've never hidden that. In fact, Europe itself as well. If Europe has consistently said for many years that the war against Ukraine has consequences for the entire continent, that means that all of Europe, this very continent, must bear the primary responsibility for this continent above all. Europe has already drawn a number of important conclusions from what is happening. Mechanisms have been launched in order to thoroughly review and assess defense and security policies. These mechanisms in the long run will ultimately allow Europe to become more independent and self-reliant when it comes to ensuring and safeguarding its own security. Or even, for instance, in terms of producing weapons or manufacturing ammunition. It's simply not serious that such a wealthy, indeed the wealthiest region in the world like Europe, today in some respects, is unfortunately losing out, even to the extremely poor and starving North Korea. Well, isn't that right? Because, unfortunately, in my own personal private opinion, in recent decades, before this full-scale aggression began, Europe became increasingly immersed in hedonism, in thoroughly enjoying and celebrating its economic and social achievements. I certainly do not want to offend Europeans, It is absolutely right and indeed entirely appropriate to be genuinely proud of and to thoroughly enjoy those significant achievements that have been accomplished and realized. These successes were attained thanks to a combination of sound, well-considered and effective economic policy, as well as sound, thoughtful and comprehensive social policy, and of course the dedicated and tireless work of the various European institutions and the European Union as a whole. But that does not mean that Europe can afford to endlessly rely on the umbrella across the ocean. And here, basically, in my personal opinion, there is a deeply rational idea, including within the American administration, that Europeans need to take greater responsibility for their own security. Of course, this cannot be achieved overnight. It can't even be achieved in just a couple of years, because this is a very complex matter. But ultimately, increasing the responsibility of individual European countries and Europe as a whole for their own security does not mean that the transatlantic bond will be broken, does it? The transatlantic bond, because the transatlantic bond will continue to remain the main condition for preserving peace and security on both sides of the Atlantic. Let us not forget that even if, thanks to our joint and coordinated efforts, we were to achieve a ceasefire as soon as tomorrow, or perhaps even manage to conclude some kind of formal peace agreement, the Russian Federation would still remain a very real and ongoing threat. And not just to Ukraine, but to all of Europe. Because we cannot expect that suddenly, in his 8th decade, Putin will fundamentally change his philosophy and worldview, nor can we even hope that if Putin is gone and someone else takes his place, Ivanov, Petrov or Sidorov, that the system itself will change. The system will not change. And as I have said, including more than once and including today at this event, Nazi Germany underwent a deep process of denazification. If Russia does not undergo a deep process of deputinization, and deputinization, just like denazification, must take place at all levels of society. It's not just the army, it's not just politics, it's also education, and the religious sphere and ethnopolitics, everything. This will take decades for the Russian Federation to eventually become, for a united Europe, something like what Canada is for the United States, for example.
States. Thank you.